Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special SSP webinar developed by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group. You are joining us today for the Workplace Needs Work. I'm Jeff Lang with the American Chemical Society, the chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group, and we're pleased you could join us today. We'll get started hearing from our presenter in just a moment, but first, your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenter and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the questions feature in the right-hand bar to send in questions, and when we have some questions for you later, you can put your answers in there as well. You can also use it to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties. We'll review any questions you have for the presenter in the QA portion of the session. At the conclusion of today's session, you'll receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You'll also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar, and 60 days after, this webinar will be available to everyone on the SSP website. Our presenter today is Susan Sullivan, Director of Diversity and Inclusion at CERES, the Cooperative Institute for Research and Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Sullivan works to attract and recruit a diverse CERES workforce and to build an inclusive workplace culture where all may thrive in their chosen profession. She's a member of the American Geophysical Union Diversity and Inclusion Committee, a member of the American Geosciences Institute Executive Committee, and a past president of the National Association of Geoscience Teachers. Thank you for speaking with us today, Susan. I'm passing the screen over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Let's see. Okay, can you see my slides all right?
We do.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for that introduction and for this invitation. Thank you, everybody, for taking your time to be here and to learn about workplace culture inclusion. I'm with CERES. We are a 1,000-person research institute at the University of Colorado Boulder. We've been working in a concerted manner on our workplace culture and inclusion since the end of 2017. So I'm here to help describe some of those first steps that you might take in understanding and addressing workplace culture inclusion. And of course, when you first get started on that kind of work, it can look like a labyrinth, and it feels like throwing things at the wall to try and see what will stick and see what will move the needle. And so the goals for today include some of the ways to start approaching culture in order to start understanding your culture, some ideas that have been working for a lot of organizations for moving forward, and then a little bit of discussion on what's on people's minds today. So keeping in mind, I was asked to do this webinar at the beginning of January, and of course in January the world was in a very different place than it is today. I had no idea that we would be in the place that we are today in terms of our culture, our society, and how we're examining our work in the academy and other scholarly spaces. Just as a reminder, when the pandemic started, workplaces and universities across the country were awash in reports of anti-Asian and Asian American harassment, discrimination, and harassment. And so my university, like so many others, started working on supporting our Asian and Asian American employees. This is a screenshot from the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, where they're tracking that sort of burden on people who live with, where they're tracking those burdens. At the same time as the pandemic took hold and the economic fallout that resulted, we found that those impacts are having a disparate proportion on people of color, including Black and Latinx and Native American people in the United States. Both the health outcomes and the economic fallout is worse. Following the killing of George Floyd, there were protests across the country and across the world demanding racial equality and an end to racial injustices. And this is a moment of energy in the movement not seen since the civil rights era. I picked this photo because these are the Denver protests, which is right down the road from where I live and work. I picked this because the man in this photo is wearing a NASA shirt, and you know, this man could be one of my colleagues. He could be working at any of the universities in our area. The things that are happening in the society around us, they don't just happen out there. They happen in here, in our academic workplaces, and it affects us in our workplaces now. This is a new call. June 10th, there was a STEM shutdown where researchers took the day not to work on their work that they did every day, but to take action and learn and reflect on what they can do to fight systemic racial inequality. That happened at my place in Ceres. And if you're wondering why this is so important, I would urge you to look at this thread on Twitter. It's called Black in the Ivory, and these are first-person accounts from Black scientists and researchers in our academies and the kinds of experiences they have every day. All of this is to point out that when I'm talking about assessment and I'm talking about things that can sound kind of dry, what we're really talking about is people's lives and people's careers, the real human impact of our work. Okay, so a lot of you have probably seen a case, the business case for diversity and inclusion in the workplace before. But as a reminder, companies with greater workplace diversity and inclusion have been found to have higher profits, increased innovation, employees are happier, suffer fewer physical and mental health issues. In a scientific context, author lists that are more diverse, the papers that result from that receive more citations. And the work that we do may be somewhat different. Differing perspectives may use different methodology, choose to pursue different research questions, and approach problems in a different way. Now, all of this is true, but the business case for diversity and inclusion has also been critiqued in that the value of people is not only about their productivity and their contribution to our bottom lines. The human case for diversity and inclusion is that we're talking about real people's lives and careers. People have invested their money, their hopes, their dreams, their education in being part of our disciplines. And that's what we're talking about when we're making our culture a place that people can thrive. Okay, so how are we doing? Academia, there's a lot of room for improvement, and that's putting it kind of mildly. Half of women faculty and staff report experiencing sexual harassment by other faculty and staff. 62% of higher ed employees report witnessing or experiencing bullying, and that's at a higher rate than in the overall American workplace. So higher ed, there's more bullying than in America at large. When you layer onto that intersectionality, being a person of color, a woman of color, being part of the LGBTQIA+ community, the experiences become even more fraught and more exclusionary than if there aren't layers of identity adding to our workplace issues. So why is that? First of all, our academic cultures are very, very hierarchical. About the only culture that's more hierarchical is the military. And the way that we train people, we have an apprentice advisor mentee model in which there are huge power disparities between the advisor and the student. that leads to a single point failure in our system, wherein students are disincentivized to rock the boat when there are problems. Furthermore, organizations are disincentivized to address celebrity researchers who bring in a lot of money and a lot of recognition to the organization. There's a disincentive for holding people accountable within our culture. Now, that can be pretty depressing. All of that is true. And nonetheless, we can disrupt those systems and we can take steps to address our culture. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is understanding that culture. I'm going to talk about assessing the culture. And the reason that it's a good idea to do that is that without assessment, usually what happens is that leaders are hearing anecdotal accounts of problems that are happening in the culture. Assessment can demonstrate the extent of issues. It can identify the ways in which different groups are experiencing the workplace differently. It can help to secure resources of money and personnel time to actually do something. It can guide the strategy. In 2017, when we first started working at CERES, we were pretty much guessing about what we needed to do. We basically were throwing stuff at it and hoping that something would work. After we got our culture survey results, we did a survey in 2018 and some focus groups. After that, we had a much better roadmap of what we needed to do. And lastly, the assessment can then demonstrate results as time goes on and show when there's changes in order to continue having the resources to make change. Okay, so here's where I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about what's happening in your workplace, not in any kind of, not with names or anything, but in the question pane, could you please write in what has your organization done to start understanding its own culture? I'm sure there's some things that have been happening. Okay, I'm starting to see some answers come in. Thank you. Okay, very nice. Thank you. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. Okay, let's see. Still learning how to use this question pane. Here we go. More's coming in. Very good. Okay. So I'm seeing a range of responses so far. Overwhelmingly, I'm seeing lots of surveys, regular surveys, surveys of membership, regular assessments sent. There is some open discussion. That's very good. Some organizations haven't started yet. There's work groups and committees being formed, task forces, and people looking both internally at workplace culture, which is primarily what I'm talking about, but also looking externally on the ways in which diversity and inclusion is reflected in our work. So that's all very good, all very appropriate. And I'll talk a little bit about, and some organizations haven't started, and that's where we are. That's as expected. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of those pathways forward might look like and why you might use some of those tools. So still talking about assessment and understanding the culture. And also I want to thank you all for participating in that and writing your answers in. So some thoughts. One is that, like politics and education, culture is local. In any organization of any size, culture is not monolithic. You can look at it overall, but really people's experience of their culture depends on which work group they're in, who their supervisor is, what the culture is within their work team and their subunit. So that has to be kept in mind as you seek to understand the culture. And then there's different tools. I'll talk about three kinds of tools, 3 kinds of methods for understanding culture, and when you might use some of those, what they're good for, what they're not good for, what to think about. And I'll show you an example of the kind of thing you can learn. So I saw a lot of mentions of culture surveys, and that is where we started at CERES. The pros of a culture survey is that it's quantitative, and the data that you get from a culture survey can be more compelling for leadership. It's no longer just some whispers or some high-profile cases, but an understanding of what's happening across the entire organization. Some of the downside is that it lacks nuance. You can find out what's happening, but not why. Another issue is that unless there is some level of trust in the organization, people may not participate. They may not be candid. And so for our first survey, we did a lot of work on working with third parties and having very many firewalls between us and anybody's identifiable data. A lot of socializing throughout the organization about the steps we were taking so that people could participate and have some confidence that they would not be made identifiable. That took a lot of work, and it pays off. You use these when you want to understand the broad picture and to convince leadership that there are really things there that need to be addressed. And then as one resource, there's a handout that you have access to. It's already loaded. There's a link there to our CERES Culture Survey report where you can see the kinds of questions we asked and the kinds of results that we got. I am allowed to share the actual instrument one by one. So if you want the actual instrument, you can contact me and I'll give you the actual instrument that we used. Now, what did we learn? We learned a whole lot of things, but this is one of the things we learned. In 2017, we were just trying things. And when we got the results of our 2018 culture survey, we found that our big story is about incivility and hostile behavior, that kind of bullying behavior that we saw on the earlier slide in hostile cultures. So we found that if people had experienced hostile treatment, things like mocking, teasing, condescending or dismissive remarks, deliberately excluding people from work, talking behind people's backs, that kind of thing. Notice I haven't even said sexual harassment and identity-based discrimination and harassment. You know, this is the whole suite of behaviors that do not support people, including the ones that aren't addressed by university policy. We found that if you have not experienced that, then there's lots of great outcomes for both men and women. If you have experienced uncivil behavior, the outcomes are very much diminished. So people, especially women, don't feel as welcome at CERES or in their work groups, don't have as much trust in their supervisors, don't feel taken seriously, feel that their identity for women, more women felt that their identity influenced their supervisor's opinion about their work. And all of that led to a problem in our statistical bottom line, which was, would people choose to work at CERES again? If they have experienced uncivil behavior, the answer to that is much more likely to be no. So this tells us, this gives us some real important things to look at when we're improving our culture. This tells us what our big story is and where we need to put our efforts. Okay, we followed our survey up with focus groups. Now, why would you use focus groups? And I saw in the question that some people are having open discussions and perhaps focus group like qualitative methodologies. Now, the advantage of focus groups, one of them, is that it allows for deeper exploration of the issues. So we know that incivility is where we need to look, but how, why, where is incivility happening? We need to know more. A downside is that it's very time consuming. Anybody who knows about qualitative methodologies knows that it takes a lot of time. It's a relatively small sample size. I think we talked with 20 odd people out of a 1,000 person organization, and it's similar at other organizations. And that means that if leadership isn't compelled, they can dismiss it as, oh, those are just the complainers. So another reason to use it, you might see that in the previous slide I talked about men and women, but I didn't talk about underrepresented minorities, or I didn't talk about our LGBT employees. Part of the reason for that is that there is not statistical signals because we don't have sufficient representation in our workplace. If we want to understand the experience of smaller groups in the workplace, these qualitative methods are important for understanding that. So if you thought that getting people to feel confident in culture surveys was hard, getting people together in a room to talk perhaps with their colleagues is an even more risky situation. So confidentiality is key. Being able to do it in a way that is and feels safe is also key. And here's an example of the kinds of things you can learn. Now, we have a group at Ceres where they said, I don't think anything bad can happen here. At which point I didn't know what to say, which is good. And they told us some things about why that was. They have a manager who's always very respectful, always thinking about gender balance on projects. That's something that we can try to scale up through the rest of the organization. And I had to include this quote: more puppy play dates as a sense to increase a sense of belonging. This is a very Boulder, Colorado way to increase belonging, where everybody is accompanied by their dogs all the time. I learned some more about where the incivility was happening. Some people were being talked about being teased and not going to HR about what they were experiencing. I learned that for one group, a lot of the incivility was happening as part of a seminar series, and that was ending up excluding people from professional opportunity. And also recognizing that in some groups, more collaboration was happening with those who shared identities with the senior scientists, and other scientists were not being invited to collaborate and not having opportunities. So that gives us some real actionable levers to work on when we're looking at our culture. And then the third kind of data that I'm going to look at, kind of method that I'm going to look at, is institutional data. And we didn't see any description of that yet in the question pane when I asked that earlier question, but that's stuff like compensation data, which I'm actually still trying to get at CU. It's demographics, hiring data, being able to see advancement throughout the organization. The pros of that is that when you can get it, it doesn't depend on people being willing to participate. It's the entire organization, which is compelling to leadership. The major downside of using institutional data is that it can be hard to get. Now, I'm very fortunate at University of Colorado. We have a wonderful institutional research group. It's very easy to work with. They're very responsive. I've not encountered any roadblocks. I have heard when I talk about this, about institutions where this kind of data is in a room in hard copy, and people have to copy it down by hand in order to get it. So that's just about impossible. So it depends on having that kind of access and that kind of functionality within an organization. You can use it to identify system-wide issues, to identify the bright spots that need to be scaled up and the gaps that need to be addressed. And here's an example. This is from Ceres, and what it shows is that we're losing representation of women as we go through our career tracks. So the more senior across the organization, the fewer women are represented. Now, this is old news. We know about this. But what's interesting, what I'm not showing here, is that I can disaggregate this across all of our organizations and be able to see that one unit actually has quite good representation across the across career seniority, and other units don't. So what's different between those units and what can we scale or address within the different units. That's what you can get with institutional data, and also because of the numbers, you can get more statistical significance. Okay, so here's another question. That's about understanding your culture. What has your organization done in order to improve your culture? I'm going to scroll down on the question pane so I can see new things coming in. Okay, good. Things are starting to come in. Great, thank you. Okay. Right. Very good. We'll talk a little bit about this as things come in. Okay. Good. A lot of people writing about what their organizations are doing. There is, I'm seeing about training, unconscious bias training, book clubs, discussion, more discussion throughout the organization, working on style and language, thinking about the external groups that you're engaging in your work, new capacity for moving forward within organizations through task forces and working groups. I think that let's see, newsletters. So in general, more attention through personnel, more knowledge through discussion and reading, more communication, and more attention paid on external partners, external customers or clients, or however you refer to your the people you work with. And that all looks about right to me. This is, we've tried some of those things, and I will talk some more about how they can all work together. So very good. Thank you again for sharing in the question pane. This is a example of a project in our discipline, my discipline of geosciences and environmental sciences. It's called Advanced Geo Partnership, and you may have seen that logo on some of my earlier slides. I'm a trainer as part of this group, and this is a discipline-wide group for us that is about improving the workplace culture. They started to address sexual harassment in geosciences, and the mission has expanded and morphed as our understanding has shifted in our discipline. So this is an organization that provides the kind of workshops that were referenced about unconscious bias, how to do things basically. And there's a whole lot of resources here that even if you're not in geosciences, this is a pretty easy access way to learn about some of the things that I'm going to talk about, and to learn more about anti-racism is coming soon, learn more about sexual harassment, learn more about creating inclusive climates, and all the rest of it. So I want you to imagine this scenario. So imagine that you are in what is now a virtual meeting, because I don't know about you, but all my meetings are virtual right now. Imagine that you're in this virtual meeting and a senior researcher is yelling at a new hire. You can see that the new employee is close to tears and very upset. And it's not the first time. This researcher has a reputation for yelling at junior colleagues and staff and for disrupting meetings. So hopefully none of you have ever experienced that, but I'll bet that some of you have. So what would happen next in most academic organizations? So you don't have to think about your particular organization. You can think about your discipline widely. Just whatever comes to mind. What do you think would happen next? Okay. Any ideas? Okay, good. Starting to see some answers. Okay, good. Answers came flooding in. For a second, I was worried. I was worried nobody knew what would happen next. Okay, so we have a series of responses. They range from nothing, like probably nothing would happen, no confrontation, no reprimand. Perhaps somebody else would have to work with the researcher. We're very conflict avoidant in academia. A lot of times people don't address issues. Somebody may circle around and talk with the new hire and encourage them, tell them to hang in there. Yeah, okay. And some people would intervene, but there's a very good question. What if that person is most senior? Yeah, so this is about what I would expect. In most academic organizations, nothing would happen, or people would be uncomfortable in the moment and then maybe circle around and talk with the junior colleague afterwards. And sadly, I think this is what happens a lot of the time. And it's what I've seen happen in some meetings, and I've also seen some other things happen. So we'll talk about what that can look like. Imagine instead that this interaction took place in an ecosystem of change, cultural change, in an organization that has been working on this. Imagine that from the time an employee comes in, they have a significant and functional onboarding where they're told what are the values, what to expect from behavior in this organization, what to do if there's a problem, how do you report on that, what actually happens. Imagine there's a code of conduct where acceptable behaviors are defined and there's teeth. So what happens when those things get violated, as they will? What if people had skills to intervene and that was just part of what happened in that organization, and that supervisors and people knew how to have conflict, knew how to have difficult conversations. Let's imagine that supervisors knew that bad behavior was part of what they could address. There's often a myth that if bad behavior doesn't violate university Title IX policies, that there's nothing you can do about it, and that's just not true. That means it's the job of HR and supervision to address it. And let's say that behavior is addressed in performance assessment and that people are held accountable. So this is a whole ecosystem of things that work together to change culture. No one of them is sufficient, and it's kind of like the links in the chain. They all have to be there in order for outcomes to be different. So here are some things that we did at Ceres. This is not just me, I'm just one person, but here's things that happened at Ceres as a result of our culture survey and the things that we learned. And some of these things were on their way, but now they're real. So now we have a year-long onboarding program that includes some of the things I was talking about. We have a person who was hired who onboarding and recruiting is part of their job. There's a new mentoring program that's available across the whole organization, and that's led by our Ceres Members Council, our employees. There's professional development fund that is not for technical stuff. It's for things like difficult conversations, leadership and management training, and pays for people to go do those things. Some units have worked with me to establish their values around culture, around diversity and inclusion, and then importantly, to align that throughout all of their policies and procedures to make sure that they are that they're actually reflecting their values throughout their business systems. We did another culture survey in 2019. I'll talk a little bit about that. And we have a new space, like what some of you mentioned, to collaborate across the organization and to have a regular meeting. And the focus of that will be on anti-racism. and that's for us to coordinate action plans. We have increased employee training across the board. We have increased supervisor training, including about progressive discipline. And there's an assessment pilot, performance assessment pilot in our largest group that I'll talk about. So that's a lot of stuff. And I'm very proud of Ceres that things are happening across the organization. And like I said, it's not just me. It's because leadership really does care and is incorporating diversity and inclusion in their work. Now, code of conduct. This is one thing we have not done at Ceres. At the University of Colorado, our code of conduct introduction is 7 pages, and it links out to about 50 ancillary policies and appendices. And so, all of our 1,000 people haven't seen it. They don't know it. A code of conduct that really works is usable and visible and flows throughout all of the work of the organization. It includes teeth, not just do this, but what happens when somebody doesn't do it. And then that's a living document that's regularly reevaluated and communicated. So we have not done this at Ceres, but those who have find it very useful. This link here, the codes of conduct, that will give you some example codes of conduct that have been found to be useful elsewhere. Again, that's on your handout. We've done training across the board. So at Ceres, we are in 4 different locations in 9 different programs and departments across campus. So it's actually a little easier now to do training because it's all virtual. Before that, we went to 2 or 3 different locations to be able to make it easy access for everybody. It doesn't have to be everybody that comes. It's not mandatory, but when enough people come, it starts to get a critical mass of people who have expectations and voice and skills. We have supervisor training, like I mentioned, especially around progressive discipline for handling problematic behavior. We've done bystander intervention, difficult conversations. We've had ally training for different identity groups. And I'm working now on bringing a large set of anti-racism meaningful trainings to go throughout Ceres. And so that's one of our next steps. Oh, whoops, didn't mean to do that. I wasn't done. Okay, I guess I am done. There were a couple more bullets there, but the performance assessment that I mentioned, I think this is really exciting. One of our largest groups is piloting this performance assessment. And the first thing you might see is that job knowledge and skills is only 50% of the assessment. So the whole rest of it is about respect and communication and being a positive influence on the organization. And what that means is that it's no longer enough to be the rock star scientist who brings in all the resources. You also have to be a positive influence on the organization in order to have top marks in your performance assessment, which is what flows into our merit increases and our promotions. So this is important and this is exciting. They're piloting this and this is something that we're watching for possible rollout across the rest of Ceres. So let's reimagine this scenario. And I'm not going to ask you to type in this time. I'm going to reimagine this scenario in a functional culture. So in a functional culture, let's imagine it 2 ways. One is that the senior researcher is not the senior leader. If they're not the senior leader, perhaps the chair intervenes and points out that the researcher is violating the code of conduct that we've all agreed to. And you can get used to saying things like, person, that behavior doesn't reflect our code of conduct, or that's not how we behave here. If it is the senior person, then there are of course, power dynamics that are into play and something else will happen. I'll talk a little bit about that. Let's imagine that that another person in the meeting can say, maybe a peer or somebody who's got higher power than the new employee, I'm really interested in what that new employee was saying, and can we circle back to that in a minute? Just provide some support in the moment. Because this is not the first time this researcher has done this kind of behavior, let's imagine that the supervisor, great comment, mute the senior researcher, sure. And then I do see the question about talking more about the training. I'll come back to that. Let's imagine that the supervisor, that senior researcher, has a skilled, difficult conversation about that behavior and how it's going to have to improve. There might even be a performance improvement plan that is part of progressive discipline. They may not have access to junior colleagues such as interns or students anymore, may not be allowed to supervise until there's an improvement. And then when the performance assessment time comes around, that researcher's supervisor takes that into account under the new performance assessment rubric, which influences what happens. Now, if in that meeting the senior researcher is the senior person, perhaps then there are reports made to that person, the senior researcher supervisor, and even though in the moment it's not perfect, it still needs to be addressed in a functional culture. A little bit about ally training and bystander intervention. Ally training had to do with different identities. So for example, safe zone training, which is about LGBTQ+ inclusion, helping everyone in the organization understand what's the climate like in our organization for people, and what does inclusion look like, and giving people some more education, some more awareness and skills. And on the 30th, we have a training that's about neurodiversity and supporting neurodiversity in our organization, recognizing the valuable contributions of our colleagues with neuroatypical skills, and also being able to support support our colleagues and have our colleagues be able to find support within their organization. Bystander intervention is about having skills in the moment in this kind of scenario. There's no such thing as a neutral bystander. People are either intervening or not, or choosing not to intervene. So how can you do that in a skilled way and in a safe way that doesn't make it worse for you or for your colleagues? So that's a little bit about that. These are all skills that we can learn. Let's see. So lastly, I want to point you back to the Advanced Geo Partnership and the timely resources that are coming up there, including creating inclusive virtual spaces, which speaks to the scenario I just mentioned. I want to point out that AGU, who is one of your member organizations for SSP, the American Geophysical Union, has put together a resource for inclusive remote meetings, and that's linked on your handout as well. Some of the things that are here might help with that scenario. Sometimes in meetings, it's not the senior person who leads the meeting in order to avoid groupthink. There's lots of things you can do in meetings, which is where a lot of the problems happen. So these are just some timely resources. With that, I want to thank you for your time. Oh, I wanted to point out this. Earlier I mentioned that you can contact me if you want to have a copy of our actual culture survey. It is comprehensive. It includes questions about sexual misconduct, identity-based discrimination, and harassment. And I did want to point out one thing that I forgot to come back to, since we do have time. You might say, well, that scenario that you just gave, it's all very well and good. That's all in your brain of pie in the sky stuff. But I did want to talk about our 2019 culture survey and the results from that. I don't have all the data back, but we did find that in one of our largest groups, the incidence of uncivil behavior went down from what was in that group 27%, which is actually not terrible in academic workplaces. It went down by half to more than half to 12%. So that's a big change. And also there was an improvement along 6 different dimensions, a statistically significant improvement, including that supervisors are more skilled at addressing problematic behavior, that people now believe more than they did a year ago that their supervisors will and can address the kind of problematic behavior we've been talking about. So improvement can and does happen. We didn't lose ground on anything else, and I don't have all the data, but that's an indicator that things are really starting to shift. And it's taken a lot of work, but it's not impossible. So with that, I want to thank you. I see some questions coming in, and I'll take questions. We have some time. We have about a little less than 15 minutes to have questions and time. What are your recommendations for addressing microaggressions in the workplace? This is hard, as we know. A lot of times people aren't even sure that microaggressions happened. And we found in our work that people who aren't sure that they're identity-based have as many bad outcomes as those who are sure that it is identity-based. Oftentimes it's pretty subtle. Oftentimes it's behind closed doors. And we also know that when you witness bad behavior, people who witness bad behavior also have bad outcomes. So this is all very important. I am not an expert on addressing microaggressions, but I would say that one of the first steps is raising people's sensitivity to knowing that things are microaggressions, understanding that it really is not okay. We're in a society where microaggressions are pretty normalized, and so it takes some effort to really know that things are not okay, and it takes some skill. So that's one of the trainings that we're bringing in, is recognizing and interrupting microaggressions around some skill. People have different capacities for being able to react in the moment, or people who are witnessing can develop skills. One strategy that I learned about recently is to have some people in the workplace be trained as their responsibility to essentially scan the environment during a meeting or something, and be able to talk to the leader after the fact about how that situation went and how that needs to be changed. So there's a whole lot of things, but I agree that microaggressions in the workplace, it's one of the most damaging things that people experience. It's like, death by 1,000 cuts that makes people think that they don't belong in our discipline and need to be somewhere else for their own well-being. So thank you for that question. What other questions do we have? Anybody wondering about your new steps that your organizations are taking, and how to use that new infrastructure? Let's see. Okay, here's a question. Yes, this is a hard one. Thank you for this question. How do you recommend striking the right balance between across-the-board efforts and those tailored to smaller parts, such as one team or department of an organization? Yes, this is hard, and it's necessary, because across-the-board efforts tend to not be as visible or not as personal, and there's people, real people, who need support across the organization. So in my work, I need to kind of toggle between across the board efforts, systematic things that maybe aren't as visible, and support for the people. And in terms of coordinating across the subunits, the way that we've approached that, and this is just starting, is in my dream world, we have a nested network of committees and action groups that are coordinating together. So so we have this virtual space, we have a Teams, we're starting a regular unit where we can, or a regular meeting where we can share action plans and coordinate and try to help each other. So for example, if I don't have resources in my part, I can coordinate with other people to bring in resources. And that way you can move together so that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing, and the effort can be at the appropriate level. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to coordinate. So basically, my mental model of the effort is as a network, and not to control the efforts that are happening, but to amplify efforts in the smaller parts and scale them as they have impact, and to be able to support those efforts by bringing in resources or helping where they need accountability to get something done. Let's see, I hope that answers that question. I see some thanks from people. That's very nice. Thank you for your time being here. Let's see. Should the conversations be done by senior leadership or professionals? I very strongly suggest that people bring in skilled facilitators. These conversations are new for a lot of people. Every organization and every person is on their own journey, and it can be hard for people to have these first conversations. So I very much recommend that people actually bring in someone who's skilled and as a help to start. Now, eventually, you need to have enough capacity in an organization to have those conversations. But to start with, I think it's good to at least have some skill. One way to do that, I have a relationship with another unit on campus where I am facilitating conversations with their employees because I'm not tied to the leadership in their unit, and that helps to build willingness to have the conversations. So you can arrange relationships like that where you can help each other and bring in skills. Let's see, anything else? Any other questions? We still have just a couple of minutes. I would also say that to that difficult conversation question, there is training called Crucial Conversations. It costs money. There are other people who can facilitate these skills. I've been very fortunate in our university to be able to find people at the university level who come in for free and lead trainings. Not every organization has that. And so what that means is that leadership has to be prepared to put actual resources into it, either to support people one-on-one to get that training and to scale it, or to bring it in organization-wide, which can often be the more cost-effective way to do it. There's lots of ways to do it. I will say that it's also helpful if the organization will pay somebody to do this work. Before Ceres hired me in my position, there was and here's a question. Another question. Before Ceres hired me, they had a volunteer committee, and it was very hard for that volunteer committee to make change. So when you're starting there, I think it's a fine place to start. But I do think the organization should seek or find resources to pay the people who are doing the work, whoever that is. That can be hard, but that's part of making change, since budgets are statements of values. Let's see, there was a question, what are your goals for Ceres? I tend to think sort of more about tactics and strategies. We're just starting on our strategic planning for D&I now that we think we know enough to do that. And so we don't have numbers. I mean, broadly, we would love for our workforce to represent the available workforce demographically. We would like our culture outcomes, our culture survey outcomes to reflect the best or better of the range of outcomes in our discipline in terms of civil behavior and whether or not people would choose to work here again. Those are some example questions, but I can't point you to a fully fledged strategic plan yet. That was starting in the before times, and then there was a pandemic that threw everything askew. So here's a question. A very interesting idea to add items such as respect to job performance. It's a new idea at Ceres. It's about, I guess, about a year, a little less than a year old. I don't think it's a new idea. We didn't make it up. And so, you know, we get to establish the rubrics for our performance assessment. We don't have one from our university that we're required to use. And so that means that performance assessments should reflect the values of the organization. And if an organization says that respect is part of our values, then it only makes sense to incorporate that into performance assessments. Here's an excellent question. Is there a wrong way to approach these efforts? Absolutely. Here's the major do not. This is not a PR effort. This has to be seen as a mission imperative. This has to be seen as essential to the heart and soul of the mission, and that failure is unacceptable. When organizations, and I've seen this too, when organizations approach diversity and inclusion as wanting to look good instead of be good, it is harmful, and it leads to cynicism and discouragement by the people who are trying to do real efforts. So it's much, much better to focus on, you know, to talk about it less than you do it. And I would say that's one of the primary ways to mess up. I think another way is kind of to focus on one piece of the culture, one piece of the ecosystem of efforts, and not do the rest. So for example, if there are trainings but not accountability for problematic behavior, then it can be a lot like window dressing, and you get the choir but not everybody. You don't get the critical mass that you need to actually make change. I would say those are two off the top of my head ways to not do it. Let's see. Yes, there's been lots of virtual signaling from companies. Virtual signaling is easy. It has a place in that people know that at least at this point you can't not say something, right? But that has to be, but there has to be a real there, or else people can see through virtual signaling very easily. And at the same time, organizations have an incentive to talk about the things that they're doing well, and that has to be balanced. It can't be just window dressing, and it can't just be PR. It has to be real. Okay, so with that, it's just about the top of the hour. I want to really thank everybody for taking their time to be here and for participating in the discussion. Oh, you can get on my calendar here at this information interview link. You can sign up on my calendar and we can talk. You're invited to do that.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. And for those of you again on the call, thank you for participating. Really appreciate, Susan, you helping to challenge us today and sharing your experience. Once again, for you on the phone, please do take the time to respond to our webinar evaluation that you'll receive via email. Your feedback helps us to continually improve this program. And please join us for the upcoming events, including 2 webinars in September. First is our early career webinar, Everything You Wanted to Know About Open Access, but Were Afraid to Ask, on September 15th. And then followed the next week on September 22nd by the Future of Preprints, Coronavirus as a Case Study. Thank you all, and we are concluded for today.